We acknowledge that the land on which we are gathered is unceded territory of the Wiyot people who continue to live and thrive today. It is surrounded by the traditional, ancestral, and present homelands of several indigenous nations, including, but not limited to, the Hupa, Karuk, Matol, Tolowa, Wailaki, and Yurok that make up Humboldt County. With our acknowledgement is an invitation to action through giving directly to the campus programs serving Indigenous students. A link will be provided in the chat. Good evening. I'm Lisa Von Maupin from the Office of the President, and I want to welcome you to the second event of this new presidential speaker series. This series was inspired by President Jackson's interest in showcasing scholarly and creative activity that brings important new thought to bear on our challenges and opportunities as a university and society. I want to thank President Jackson for his vision for this series and beyond, that his vision for HSU as an inclusive and thriving organization. Thank you also to Mary Bockover and the Department of Philosophy, Dean Rosamel Benavides Garb and the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences, Joy Finney, Drew Meyer, Kristen Gould, and anyone I have missed for your partnership in making this possible. And thank you, each one of you in attendance, for joining us tonight. Each annual speaker series will follow a theme related to an area of priority for our campus. This year, our theme is racial equity, and we are thrilled to welcome Dr. George Yancy of Emory University. Dr. Yancy will speak for about 45 minutes, and we will reserve the final 30 minutes for your questions. Please place your questions in the Q&A space as we go. And please, an important note, Dr. Yancy will share text tonight that contains vitriolic language some will find offensive. Dr. Yancy will also warn you when this is going to occur in his talk, and we will place resource information in the chat for your reference. Each event in the Presidential Speaker Series also features scholarly and creative work happening at HSU related to the event. Tonight, our goal was to have you learn a little bit more about the student and faculty partnership that is the long-standing philosophy forum. I was to introduce to you Professor Mary Bockover, who is having technical difficulties that make it impossible for her to appear. Instead, we will put information in the chat about the philosophy forum. But I want to thank Professor Bockover, who has educated, collaborated with, and touched the lives of HSU students for over 30 years. Professor Bockover, we are grateful for your contributions and for your partnership tonight. It is now my pleasure to introduce to you someone that we all know very well, Dr. Rosamel Benavides Garb, who will introduce our speaker this evening. Dr. Benavides Garb is a professor of Spanish language, culture, and Latin American literature. He now serves as the interim dean of the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences after many years as chair of the Department of World Languages and Cultures at Humboldt State University. Dr. Benavides Garb has extensive background in administration and has been instrumental in developing numerous international programs for our university. As a first-generation university graduate convinced that education is vital for social growth in America, Dr. Benavides Garb is firmly dedicated to our students and holds that HSU is a unique place for such growth. In this regard, he and the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences have been vital in supporting the Philosophy Forum and many other student-centered events. It is our genuine good fortune to have Dr. Benavides Garb serving our college and university, and an honor to introduce him during this forum. Dr. Benavides Garb.
Buenas tardes y bienvenidos a la Universidad Estatal de Humboldt y a la Facultad de Artes, Humanidades y Ciencias Sociales. Lisa, thank you for this generous introduction. I would like to take just a minute to thank Mary Buckover for her leadership and vision regarding the Philosophy Forum. Philosophy and philosophers are critical members of our institution. I wanted to acknowledge the work of our philosophy faculty and philosophy students. Through the Philosophy Forum, we have been able to participate in relevant national conversations. Today, more than ever, we need critical philosophy and critical philosophers. Dr. George Yancy is the Samuel Candor Dobbs Professor of Philosophy at Emory University and a Montgomery Fellow at Dartmouth College, one of the highest honors. He is also the University of Pennsylvania Inaugural Fellow in the Provost Distinguished Faculty Fellowship Program. Dr. Yancy is the author, editor, and co-editor of over 20 books, including Black Bodies, White Gazes, The Continuing Significance of Race in America, 2017. Look a White, Philosophical Essays on Whiteness, 2012. Backlash, What Happens When We Talk Honestly About Racism in America, 2018. Across Black Spaces, Essays and Interviews from an American Philosopher, 2020. He's known for his influential essays and interviews at the New York Times philosophy column, The Stone, and the prominent political website, Truth Out. He's also Philosophy of Race book series editor at Lexington Books. So let me properly welcome our keynote speaker for tonight. I'm honored, orgulloso, to welcome Dr. George Yancy to Humboldt State University.
Thank you so very much. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Good. Thank you so very much for that wonderful introduction. And I like your proper introduction with the Humboldt cap. Yeah, I've got this E for Emory right here. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. I would like to thank the philosophy department, Mary Bockover and her colleagues, the Philosophy Forum students, the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences, Dean Rosamel Benavides Garb, and for his introduction, and the Office of the President, President Tom Jackson. Also, thanks to all of you in this Zoom space that I can't see, but I know you're there, for attending a talk which is not your normal talk. In fact, I think it's a difficult talk to hear, especially as it refuses to speak gently, because I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to speak gently. Now, if I use terms that are not typical, that you haven't heard before, particularly given that philosophers have their own lexicon, be sure to ask me during the Q&A to define a term, to elaborate on a term, because again, all of us have our terms in our different disciplines. So feel free, because the language for me just slips out of my mouth like it's the lingua franca of philosophers. So make sure you catch me on that. Okay, I think I've got this to about 40 minutes, or I may even finish earlier. So here we go. So I begin by arguing that parrhesia, which is spelled P-A-R-R-H-E-S-I-A, that parrhesia, or fearless or courageous speech, is so important when discussing issues regarding race, but especially whiteness. Philosopher Michel Foucault says that, quote, parrhesia then is linked to courage in the face of danger. It demands the courage to speak the truth in spite of some danger, end quote. But along with courageous speech, we need courageous listening. which I see as an openness to have one's assumptions shattered, one's self fissured, to have one's sense of ethical, epistemological, embodied, and affective certainty called into question, to have one's self touched to the point of vertigo and perhaps even crisis. I say crisis because that's part of the title of the talk, which is Between Pessimism and Optimism, white crisis. For me, crisis must reside at the core of what we might call so-called white innocence. Part of courageous speech in philosophy is to be a troublemaker, a contemporary gadfly. Being a troublemaker involves risk. Critical cultural theorist Bell Hooks says that she came to theory because she was hurting, because she was in pain. How many of you here in this Zoom space came to this talk because you're hurting or you're in pain? Or did you come because it was required, perhaps even to get credit? How many came to do theory as theoros, which means to be a spectator? Or did you come to die just a little, to empty yourselves? I have a small task that I always ask audience members to do, but I usually do this in person, so I had to change the language up a little bit because it's a case where I get each of the audience members to look at each other. So I can't get you to do that. So I'll have to say something like, think about that person who you love, right? Or think about that friend. So I want you to do that, take this moment to think deeply and intimately about someone that you love and someone that you care about. So just take a couple of seconds to do that. Okay, having thought about that, I want you to keep in mind that 100 years from now, we can all be pretty sure that none of us will be alive. None of us will be alive in this Zoom space. And I want you to drink that in. We will be rotting, stinking corpses. Or as philosopher Cornel West is fond of saying, we will be the culinary delight of terrestrial worms. And it seems to me that there's something very vital between birth and the grave that is so incredibly important. And of course, keep in mind that we tell ourselves various narratives. Each of you have ideas about what may happen after death, but we don't know this indubitably. If you read Descartes, we don't know it indubitably. We don't know it with absolute certainty whether or not there is something after we die. So technically, we could be gone forever. The spark of consciousness that each one of us have at the moment, when we die, could be gone for absolutely ever. And I mean, at no other time in the history of this universe appearing again. So this small task, this small exercise is not about nihilism. It's not to play jokingly with our human condition, but it's about creating in us a sense of common embodied vulnerability, and thereby a shared sense of embodied commonality. The point here is that we ought to tarry, we ought to linger with our finitude, because this life, this moment right here, right now, is perhaps all that we have. To tarry with our own death, its imminence, should raise the ethical weight of not postponing the urgency of facing what I'm going to call the lie of white supremacy, or the lie of a post-racial America, or the ways in which each of us participates or perpetuates forms of hurt and pain, or participates in those forms of hurt and pain. So I fear that I will not leave you with much hope after this talk, though you'll hear hope within it. But perhaps we need something far more unnerving. Perhaps we need what I call post-hope, that moves to the rhythm of a different form of temporality. We need something more dangerous, something more disconcerting, unnerving, alarming, perhaps even traumatic. It seems to me that what I'm suggesting here is compatible with parrhesia. When it comes to discussing whiteness, issues around racism, within contexts like this one, we mustn't be like Odysseus, who dared to be dangerous, or rather who dared to be adventurous. In fact, he dared not to be dangerous, and yet remain safe. You must allow the sirens to sing to you without the safety of a mast, without plugging up your ears with wax. You ought to allow for the unpredictable spaces of openness, and an openness that is capable of fracturing calcified norms and unproductive sedimented practices, and embodied orientations. You must be daring. You must be vulnerable, which means that you must be open to be wounded. You must be open to rethink how you are already touching others. Indeed, touching others while tracing or while leaving traces of pain and suffering. Perhaps some of you have heard of the term haptic, which means to touch. This is what I'm talking about, haptic relationships. More specifically, when it comes to intimate and courageous discussions regarding whiteness, we must ask more from white people. White people must be open to die. Now, let me give a qualifier. If you're taking notes, do not put in your notes that Dr. Yancy came to your university to say that white people must die in a physical sense. I'm not meaning that at all. But there are different forms of death. So I'm not talking about physical death, but a death to white stubbornness, a death to white denials, a death to white epistemological ignorance, a death to white arrogance, a death to white narcissism, a death to white goodness, a death to white fears, a death to white color evasion, a death to white privilege, a death to white denials, a death to white self-righteousness, a death to white illusions of safety, a death to heroic whiteness, a death to claims of non-complicity, indeed, a death to your white innocence, a death to all those tricks that white people often play to convince themselves that they are fine, that they are the good ones, the sophisticated ones, the uncomplicated white allies. I know about risk and the failure of white others to listen courageously, to undergo that required death, that required embodied unsuturing is a phrase that I use. Again, we can leave that for Q&A. Some of you might know that I wrote in 2015 a very controversial letter called Dear White America, which generated over 2,000 comments at the New York Times, The Stone. For that letter, I received tons of hate mail, really vitriolic white supremacist responses in my university inbox, voicemail, snail mail, and even postcards. So in some cases, white people would actually write letters, take them to the post office, put a stamp on the envelope, just to call me a nigger in writing. Now that N-word's gonna come up a few times. Some of us can use it, some of us can't. I get to use it. As some of you might also know, police presence was necessary during some of my public talks. When I went to class, I had to have escorts by police, by university police to my class. White supremacist websites, so-called, discussed the letter. And I was invited to appear on Fox News and other social media outlets, all of which I decided to decline. So here are a few of those responses that I received from white readers. I mean, there were tons, but I've selected just a few. And as you listen to them, I hope that you grasp a sense of the existentially and affectively dangerous work that is at stake when it comes to critically engaging the theme of whiteness and white supremacy in North America. And as you listen, keep in mind that I referred to my letter as one of love, and yet I received so much white vitriolic backlash in return. What I received might be said to function as a discursive likeness to the storming of the Capitol on January 6th. So here's the warning. Here's the language. It's brutal. Here it comes. I've eliminated some of it for my sake and for your sake. So here we go. Voice messages. Quote, "Dear nigger professor, you're a fucking racist. You're a piece of shit destroying the youth of this country. You're neither African nor American. You're a pure 100% nigger. You would never marry outside your nigger race. That's a fact. You're a fucking smug nigger. You are uneducated with education. You're a fucking animal, just like all Black people in the United States of America, including that nigger Kenyan that was born in fucking Kenya that has usurped the White House. Yes, it is called the White House for a reason, because white people made this country great, you fucking nigger," end quote. Quote, "Hey, Georgie boy, you're the fucking asshole or racist asshole. You wouldn't have a job if it wasn't for affirmative action. Somebody needs to put a boot up your ass and knock your fucking head off your shoulders, you stupid fucking goddamn racist son of a bitch. You fucking race baiting sons of bitches," then it gets plural for some reason. Then this person goes on, "Man, you're just asking to get your fucking asses kicked. You need your fucking asses kicked. You stupid motherfucker. Quit fucking race baiting asshole," end quote. Inbox messages. Quote, "Professor Yancy, all your studies have forced me to examine my self-image and my white racist mind. You clearly state that no matter what I think, I'm a racist. Okay, cool. Thank you for clearing that up. Now I am forced, because you tell me I can say nothing else, fuck you, nigger, as always, the white guy, end quote. Quote, kill yourself, do it immediately, end quote. White supremacist websites, quote, this ugly fucking nigger is just asking for access to more white females. I mean, I'm just gonna pause for a moment there. Listen to that, listen to what this individual is saying, that somehow I wrote the letter, Dear White America, because I wanted to date white women. Imagine. And our question ought to be, whose desire is this? It's not my desire. So we have to figure out whose imaginary is this racist, deeply problematic language operating or coming from, operating within and coming from. Quote, finishing the quote, in a sane world, this ugly nigger would be beheaded ISIS style. Make America white again, end quote. And I often joke a little bit because you have to joke when you receive these kinds of messages, which I still receive, by the way. It's the point where he says, the ugly that I have a problem with, right? If you want to know how I look, just go ahead and look at my, I mean, the person could have looked at my page and seen this handsome guy that you're looking at the moment. That's my way of trying to maintain sanity here. Quote, this nigger needs to have a meat hook lovingly. Well, you know, time to use your own imagination, end quote. A meat hook? Listen to this language. Quote, you can dress a nigger up in a suit and tie and they'll still be niggers, end quote. Quote, this ignorant monkey has no audience but other ignorant monkeys, end quote. Quote, Yancy, flights leave for Africa every day. Take one and take a brother, this person spells it B-R-U-T-H-A, a brother with you. We can all admit bringing you to this country was a mistake. So let us get rid of you and correct the mistake. You are not happy here. We are not happy with your behavior, so do it, end quote. Quote, there are two ways you can return to Africa, on a passenger ship or in a coffin freighter. Choose quickly, end quote. Some of you might also know that I wrote an article for the New York Times entitled, I Am a Dangerous Professor. That article was in response to the fact that my name appeared on what is called the Professor Watch List, which still exists, by the way, you can check it out, which is a conservative website created by a conservative youth group known as Turning Point USA. The job of this watch list is to monitor professors who teach so-called leftist propaganda. I've never publicly or privately referred to myself as a leftist. To my knowledge, I'm the only Emory professor who was listed. In that article, I argued that the watch list is indicative of the madness of George Orwell's 1984. There was one message that I received from a white male who apparently discovered Dear White America for the very first time. He wrote, quote, here it goes again, more language. Quote, I read your rant regarding white people, and I'm proud to inform you that I will never feel any guilt or shame for being white or who I am. Fuck you, you race-baiting piece of shit. You're just another nigger with a chip on his shoulders that's looking for excuses to justify his hatred. And guess what, asshole? And all of this is in caps. Nobody white gives a fuck what you think. My only regret is that I didn't hear your bullshit in person so that I could call you a fucking nigger to your face, you worthless bitch, and then kick your black ass until you are half dead. Fuck off, boy, end quote. So I want you to tarry and linger with that language, to know that this is not something out of the white temporal zone of the 1930s or the 1960s, but this was sent to me in 21st century white America. I had not anticipated how the onslaught of vile and racist discourse would leave a wound, would traumatize. My physiology registered the wounds, mood swings, irritability, trepidation, disgust, anger, nausea. On one white supremacist website, the white writer wrote the following: nigger, 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 right down the page. My question is, why so many times ought I be reminded? Why the overkill? Some of you might know Theo Shaw as one of the Jenna Six. The Jenna Six were 6 Black teenagers in Jenna, Louisiana, who were convicted in 2006 for the beating of Justin Barker, a white student at the local Jenna High School. Many believed, given the complexity of the case, that their convictions, that is to say the Jenna Six, were too severe and racially motivated. Years back, Theo Shaw, one of the Jenna Six, wrote to me and asked a very difficult but very probing and profound question. He asked me, he said, quote, "Dr. Yancy, is to be Black and male in America like being on death row?" End quote. And of course, I would include Black women as well. You should know that Theo Shaw is now a successful lawyer working, as he says, to push against a criminal justice system that too often dehumanizes Black and brown people and the poor. On the one hand, I didn't want to taint or potentially muddy Shaw's aspirations because I was looking after him as a Black male, as a young Black male. On the other hand, I didn't want him to ever forget that to white America, he is indeed a nigger. W.E.B. Du Bois, in a speech that he delivered in Peking, China, at the age of 91, sums up an important message that all too familiarly speaks to Black life in North America. Du Bois said, quote, "In my own country for nearly a century, I've been nothing but a nigger," end quote. I felt the need to tell the truth. So my answer to Theo Shaw was and is clear. Given white America's history vis-a-vis the Black body, yes, being Black in white America is indeed like being on death row. And if you have any doubts, then I would ask you to ask George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Botham Jean, Stephon Clark, Danny Ray Thomas, Trayvon Martin, Jordan Davis, Renisha McBride, Eric Gardner, Walter Scott, Sandra Bland, Laquan McDonald, Eric Harris, Tamir Rice, John Crawford, Ayanna Stanley Jones, Michael Brown, Renika Boyd, Samuel DuBose, Freddie Gray, Philando Castile, and so many others. The examples of white racist vitriolic language that I shared with you is what I would call spectacular forms of expressed racist violence. Yet there are also the subtle forms, the everyday, quotidian forms of embodied whiteness, the innocent whiteness that is still violent and still overwhelmingly painful. This section is called Clicking Sounds and Black Embodiment. White filmmaker Amy Sands tells the story of how she and her white sister would travel from Westchester County to New York City with their grandparents. She says that when they reached Black neighborhoods, the windows of their grandparents' cars would close and the doors would lock, quote, "until dark faces appear on the street, then the sleek electric windows slide up and suck closed. The automatic locks click down, click down. The dark people are sealed out, we are sealed in," end quote. When I walk down the street and pass by cars filled with white people, the sounds of car doors locking are deafening. Click, 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 click. Indeed, the clicking sounds are always already accompanied by white nervous gestures and eyes that want to look, but are hesitant to do so. The clicks, and by clicks, I just mean the innocent act, quote unquote, innocent act of the index finger, the white index finger locking the door, or maybe pressing a button, right? And the door clicks. The clicks ensure the safety of white people, effectively re-signifying their white bodies as in need of protection, vis-a-vis the sight of danger, doom, death, Blackness, my Blackness. In fact, the clicks begin to return me to myself as this dangerous beast, a phantom, rendering my body the site of microtomy and volatility. The clicks attempt to seal my identity as a dark savage. The clicking sounds, they mark me, they reinscribe me, rematerializing my presence, as it were, in ways that I know to be untrue, in ways that are not me. Unable to stop the clicking, unable to stop white women from tightening the hold of their purses as I walk by, unable to stop white women from crossing to the other side of the street once they see me walking in their direction, unable to stop white men from looking several times over their shoulders as I walk behind them, minding my own business, unable to establish a form of recognition that creates a space of trust or liminality. There are times when I want to become their fantasy, to become their black monster, their boogeyman. In the case of the clicks, there are times when I want to pull open the car door and shout, "Surprise! You've just been carjacked by a ghost, a fantasy of your own creation. Now get the hell out of the car." But of course, this act of agency, this act of righteous indignation, this act of protest would simply reinforce the racist stereotype of the Black male as brutal and as violent. But what if the clicking sounds could speak? What would they communicate to me? What would they say? Keep in mind that for those whites in the car, this is a case of an innocent white index finger, again, locking their car door. But what do the locks, how do they speak to me? Click, nigger, click, nigger. The clicking sounds would begin to fragment my existence, cut away at my integrity, depicting me in the form of an essence, a solid type, a stereotype. Click thug, click criminal, click thief, click danger, click hypersexual, click the genital, click predator, click violent, click wild, click primitive, click angry, click savage, click rapist, click evil, click demon. Guys, remember the case of Michael Brown and the police officer who said he looked like a demon. I am on the receiving side of the clicks, and yet those whites in their cars, through their sheer act of locking their doors, perform their white identities as in need of safety, as in need of protection. The clicks signify multiple layers of their identity. Click white, click, white, click pure, click innocent, click good, click law-abiding, click vulnerable, click decent, click threatened, click prey, click better than, click epistemically credible, click civilized, click persons as such, click human, click safe. So you see I'm operating here with a certain kind of what Frantz Fanon called a racial Manichaean divide, the difference between me and them. Hearing so many clicks, I'm reminded of Du Bois, where he writes, quote, "Between me and the other world, there's an ever unasked question. How does it feel to be a problem?" End quote. This is a case where white people have problems, but Black people are problems. It's ontological. And for those who aren't familiar with the term ontology, it comes from ontos, which means being. We might argue this way: white people commit crimes, but Black people are criminality, or brown people are criminality. That is a distinction that is ontological. We are criminals by nature, according to this assumption, or racist assumption. Yet I want to ask a different question. How does it feel to be a white problem? Rethinking the term nigger through the process of reversal, Black literary figure James Baldwin says, quote, "But if I am not the nigger, and if it is true that your invention reveals you, then who is the nigger?" End quote. Baldwin goes on to say, quote, "I give you your problem back. You're the nigger baby. It isn't me." End quote. I want you to think about that in terms of what it means. Not only are the bodies that initiate the clicks performing their white innocent identities through the clicks, but the clicks themselves install white innocent identities, hail white innocence, and solidify white innocence. The clicks are not pure auditory data, but markers of social meaning, signifiers of embodied regulated space, forms of disciplining and policing bodies, and part of a racial and racist web of significance that bespeaks sedimentation of racial history and racist iteration. After so many clicks on so many occasions, I'm installed as a stranger to myself, where I'm forced to ask a peculiar question: where is my body? Now, if you want to think about this analogously, think about, if you're a woman, think about the ways in which male patriarchy or androcentricity or misogyny, the way in which certain toxic forms of masculinity truncates your body in ways that are perverse and sexually objectificational. And think about the ways in which the meaning of your body is taken from you, such that you might be able to pose the question, where is my body that you've taken away from me? In terms of the clicks, this is a case where white normative assumptions or white embodied performances function to hail the Black body as that which is, and this is a little fancy language, epistemologically and ontologically given. Epistemology is a study of knowledge, comes from episteme. And the argument here is that here is a situation that involves the collapse of both being and knowing, or ontology and epistemology, into each other without much slippage. What it, the Black body, is and how it is known is constructed through white gazes, bodily gestures, visual images, various representations, and discursive practices that have overdetermined its being and constructed the Black body as a denigrated thing, T-H-I-N-G. Black body is thing. And this is for philosophers, but I think we're all philosophers, but I'm going to drop some names that you may or may not have heard of. But here we go. The use of the term thing within this context is more than a tropological reference. Think of the philosopher Hegel. Hegel thought that Black people did not possess what he called Geist in German, which means spirit. In fact, Hegel says, quote, "Nothing consonant with humanity is to be found in the Negro's or the Black's character," end quote. For Hegel, the Negro is an animal person, sensuous and without subjectivity and self-consciousness, and the capacity of representation. This is why the Negro, according to Hegel, is unable to represent in an abstract sense that human flesh is a body that is capable of psychological assumptions and not simply an object of the senses or something to be eaten. Hence, the suggestion of cannibalism. Or think of the philosopher Immanuel Kant, who held that to be Black from head to toe is clear proof that what a Black person says is stupid. Let me explain a little bit about what that means. So Immanuel Kant was in conversation with a guy named Father Labat. And Father Labat had just been told a story by a Black carpenter. And the Black carpenter had said this to Father Labat, something like, you know, you give your women too much latitude. And then when they take advantage of that latitude, then you complain. This is what this carpenter said. It's a bit sexist, but he was saying this to a white guy named Father Labat. Father Labat told that story to Immanuel Kant. Kant found out that the guy who told the story was Black. And Kant said, there might be something to what he said, but the fact that he's Black from head to toe is clear proof that what he said was stupid. So if you were to put a curtain over my body and Immanuel Kant was alive and I said something brilliant, Immanuel Kant, without seeing me, would say, let's say, that is absolutely brilliant. Let me meet the guy behind the curtain. Once you remove the curtain, Kant would have to say, oh my goodness, I'm absolutely mistaken, because he's Black from head to toe, clear proof that what he says is stupid. And keep in mind that this is the same Immanuel Kant who believed that all Black people were born white at birth. And look, if you've read Immanuel Kant, you know that he's a significant philosophical figure. He wrote 3 critiques. He's the author of the Critique of Pure Reason. And yet this German genius thought that all Black babies were born white at birth, with the exception of a Black ring around our navels and our genitalia were Black. And somehow that metastasizes as we get older to cover our entire bodies. And our question is, where did Kant learn this? He never left Königsberg. So where did he see a Black body born white? And let's keep in mind, there are other bizarre examples of this. Take Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, in his notes on the state of Virginia, argued that the orangutan, the male orangutan, prefers to have sex with Black women than the female of its own species. Where did Thomas Jefferson learn that? That's our question. In short, the Black body has endured a process of both inscription and description, both terms intimately linked. Or think of the lynched Black body as a problem in need of discipline. And I'm going to put out a warning here again. There are examples here that are a bit, I shouldn't say a bit, that are profoundly unconscionable and difficult to hear, but I'm going to talk about them. 2 examples. And again, we're thinking about the Black body as thing. And I want you to think here of overkill. Why the overkill? For example, in 1934, 23-year-old Claude Neal was accused of killing a white woman. And it is said that a confession was wrung out of him, meaning that it was forced, twisted, or strained out of him, meaning we have no reason to believe that Claude Neal killed anyone. And we know this from, if you look at the data, there was a case where a Black man was hungry and he knocked on the door of a white woman, and it said that she was startled. Later that day, he was lynched because he startled a white woman. Well, Claude Neal was in his cell. A group of white men dragged his body from the cell and they castrated him. They cut his penis off. Imagine the gore, imagine the blood, imagine the pain. They then took his penis and they stuck his penis into his own mouth and they forced him to say that I like it. And then they cut off his testicles and they stuffed those into his mouth as well. Imagine the blood running from his own mouth, from his own lips, and the pain of that, to say, I like it. His sides were sliced. They tied a noose around his neck so tight that he would lose consciousness. And then they would loosen it so that he could gain consciousness again, so the torturing could begin all over again, where they would cut off a limb, cut off a finger, cut off a toe while he was still alive. Eventually, they just killed him. They dragged him to a nearby town where little white children with sharpened sticks got to stab at the body as well. Eventually, it was burned. And as you know, at these sites of lynching, there were sites of commodification, sites of capitalism, where white people would take pictures, where they'd take parts of the body. In fact, it wasn't unusual for white people to write to their relatives on postcards and say, "You missed the barbecue," namely the burning of the Black body. Or think of 21-year-old Black female Mary Turner. And we often don't hear about Black women being lynched. Mary Turner was 8 months pregnant. Again, the accusation was that a Black person, a Black male, had killed or raped a white person. The problem with that is that when you are Black and being accused of a crime, you are fungible, meaning exchangeable with other Blacks. So we don't have the privilege of being individuals. So white people would not just try to lynch the one who was so-called guilty, but any Black body that appeared, they would lynch. So they lynched about 10 Black bodies, one of whom happened to be our dear friends, the hard story to tell, Mary Turner's husband. When she said that she would report them, these white people tied her up by her ankles. She was hanging upside down. They threw motor oil and gasoline on her. Remember, she's 8 months pregnant. And they set her alight with her body burning, with her screaming. At which point a white man walks over with a butcher's knife and stabs into her abdomen, ripping a hole in her abdomen, at which point the baby falls to the ground. According to reports, the baby let out one cry, at which point either the same white man or another white man walked over. And I know you know what a delicate, fragile infant's head looks like. And he crushed that infant's head under his boot. And then it said that hundreds of bullets were fired into her body. And if 1934 is too remote to engender a sense of the gravity of the problem of how Black people are treated like things, and there are many examples of this, but I decided to take you back into history a bit. Think of 1999 in New York, when Black male Amadou Diallo, a thing like Essence, always on the brink of violence. He was shot at 41 times by police officers. According to reports, there were bullets even in his feet as he was falling. He made the mistake of taking his hand and reaching into his back pocket and pulling out something. This is a case where I would ask you to tell me what it is, but I'm going to say what it is. It was a wallet. A wallet. The police officer said gun. My question to you this evening is, what is it about a Black body that pulls out a wallet or cell phone that somehow phantasmatically becomes a weapon? Think of Tamir Rice. What's going on here? And he was hit with 19 bullets. 19 bullets. Or think of Black male Abner Louima in 1997, who was handcuffed by white police officers in the car. He was beaten on his way down to the police station. They said that he started a fight at this party, which he didn't do. They had him at the police station in handcuffs, hence he was not a threat. A police officer walked up behind him and took a broomstick handle and shoved it so far up his rectum that it damaged his stomach. And then the police officer said to have run around the police station saying something like, "This is how you break a man in." What's going on there? Why the overkill? Why the use of the phallic object? Or think of Susan Smith, the white woman who in 1994 drowned her children and blamed it on a Black man. What is it about telling the story of the Black man that's so believable? Think about Charles Stewart, another white man, who in 1989 shot his own pregnant wife in the head and shot himself in the abdomen and then blamed it on a Black man. Where the mayor of Boston, which is where this happened, said, "We are going to catch that urban savage," when in fact it was Charles Stewart himself. But what about being a Black philosopher within a country and within academic contexts where Black intelligence is denied? Where, for example, I become an oxymoron as a Black philosopher, standing here, I should say sitting here, only mimicking speech. The philosopher David Hume, I'm sure you've heard of him, another great, He said that Negroes, Black people, that we are parrots. I mean, he literally said we're parrots. And what did he mean by that? We're tropical birds. This natural parroting capacity and other presumptive characteristics, according to Hume, would not be the case if nature had not made an original distinction between different breeds of persons. Worse off than the poets, critiqued by Plato, Blacks even lack inspiration. In other words, for Hume, Black people say intelligent things, but we don't know what it is that we say. So for an example, if Hume were here with us and I said something like, to be or not to be, that is the question, whether 'tis noble in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of trouble by imposing in them. If I said that, and Hume asked me, what does it mean? According to Hume, I would not know. I can only quote things. I can only mimic things. As Cornel West says, I'm never a voice, I'm just an echo, according to Hume. Or think here of philosopher Cornel West, who was stopped by a white police officer who accused Cornel West of trafficking cocaine. He told philosopher Cornel West that he said to him, that is to say, Cornel West said to the white police officer, look, I'm a professor of religion. And the police officer said, quote, yeah, and I'm the Flying Nun. Let's go, nigger, end quote. Now, I know many of you may not know what the Flying Nun is, but it was a sitcom played by Sally Field, where she was a nun and she would adjust her habit and she would fly. That was basically it, right? But it was funny. If you want to look at some old reruns, go back and look at it. But notice what the police officer's saying, the white police officer. He's saying to Cornel West, look, you can't be Black and a professor of philosophy or religion. Because if you are, I'm the Flying Nun, meaning I'm a fiction. And since I know I'm not a fiction, you can't be a professor of religion or philosophy. West might be said to be something fit for teratology. For those who don't know that word, which is a powerful word, T-E-R-A-T-O-L-O-G-Y. Teratology means the study of monsters. And in other words, perhaps Cornel West is like Frankenstein's monster, where putting together Blackness and philosophy is monstrous. My white students. My white students are always reminding me that they are not racist. We've made progress, they say. We're not like our parents and grandparents. We live in a post-racial America in which you can be whatever you want to be, if only you try hard enough. We never own Black people. We don't use the N-word. We have plenty of Black friends. We love rap music, and we date Blacks, Asians, and Latinos. So when it comes to race and racism, most, if not all of my white students claim to know about the absence of their own racism. They're certain that they are not racist. They easily lay claim to their white innocence. They are, in short, at peace with who they are. Yet, I want to argue that they are at peace within the context of actually perpetuating white racism. What if at the end of the day, they continue to be white racists despite all of their good intentions and honorable actions? That's something I want you to think about. As the so-called good whites, my white students believe that they are already positioned beyond the muck and mire of contemporary forms of white racism, white privilege, white power, and white complicity. Indeed, there are many of my white students who give the impression that they were born from the head of a god, like Athena from the head of Zeus, fully mature and unscathed by the reality of white racism, never giving thought to the assumption that white racism is not determined or exhausted by introspective examination alone, but that they already have been dispossessed by whiteness, where their white psychic life is formed through sociality, a site of relational constitutionality, resulting in an opaque white racist self that is always already prior to a conscious and deliberate act of taking up the issue of one's own white racism. That may need some explaining. I'm ready when Q&A happens. Here's the challenge. I challenge the same white students to keep a journal of examples of white racism that they encountered at home, at school, or just within the context of everyday conversations. Many of them were pretty sure that their journals would come back sparse and perhaps even empty. And this is what the sociologist Joe Fagan calls backstage racism. It's when white students go into contexts of only white people and take notes secretly about what they say. Toward the end of the semester, all of my white students were deeply shocked. In fact, by the end of the semester, they had to question their sense of certainty about the non-existence of their own white racism. Some came away deeply troubled by the awareness that white racism is front and center within their families, social groups, and within their dorms. I'm going to share 5 of those examples here, and then we can move on to the conclusion. So here are 5 entries where white students silently observed their white peers and family members and jotted down notes. Again, in these cases, my white students decided to take these notes while in their company. First white student, quote, "The first day back from spring break, we had a Black student move in. When my other floor mates came and noticed this, one of them ran down the hallway, possibly inebriated, screaming, 'There's a nigger on the floor now, guys, watch your stuff,' end quote. My question is, if you're Black, have you ever been looked upon suspiciously as if you were a thief, a criminal, as you were minding your own business?" Second white student, "One white guy told me his secret thoughts while he was boxing. He said that he always imagined his white girlfriend being banged by some really big Black guy, and that this makes him so pissed off that he could go all out in boxing," end quote. I want you to just think about that one, right? What is going on there, right? Why didn't this white male, when he was boxing, just imagine maybe something happening to one of his family members? What was it about this white male imagining his white girlfriend, as he put it, and forgive me for this language, but that's their language, being banged by some really big Black guy that made him effective at boxing? What's going on there? Third white student, quote, "When I was on the elevator, I realized as a Black man and woman walked onto the elevator with me, I was clutching my bag close to my body and moved it to the shoulder away from them. I had no reason to clutch my bag other than the fact that they were Black," end quote. My question is, if you're Black, have you ever had this experience where white people clutch their bags while they're approaching, or while you're approaching them, or while on an elevator? Fifth white student, quote, "I went to get my nails done with one of my white friends, and while we were picking out our nail polish colors, I asked her what she thought of a dark purple. Jokingly, she said, quote, that dark of a nail polish would make my nails look like nigger nails," end quote. What's going on there? Last and fifth white student, quote, "One white girl was talking about why she could not date a Black guy, and she mentioned the Black hands." So these hands right here, it's Black hands. The white girl said, "When they turn over their hand, that is really gross. They look like gorilla hands," end quote. My question is, why are Black people still depicted as monkeys in the 21st century? Conclusion. What if, as James Baldwin reminds us, quote, "it is the innocence which constitutes the crime," end quote. Unlike the forms of spectacular white racism shared earlier, what if we've looked in the wrong direction? Perhaps the problem is whiteness itself. Perhaps its innocence is the knee on Black America, responsible for its desperate call, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe, I can't breathe, I can't breathe." Barbara Applebaum writes, quote, "The white complicity claim maintains that all whites, by virtue of systemic white privilege that is inseparable from white ways of being, are implicated in the production and reproduction of systemic racial injustice," end quote. Notice that she links systemic white privilege, white ways of being, and systemic racial injustice. So whiteness structurally perpetuates racial injustice. Given the history of whiteness, its phantasmatic creations, its distortions, its lies, its bad faith, its epistemological ignorance, and its expansionist and, dare I argue, consumptive logics, I think that we can conclude with David Rodinger, where he writes, quote, "It is not merely that whiteness is oppressive and false. It is that whiteness is nothing but oppressive and false," end quote. So the question I'm asking you to entertain here is, what does whiteness mean? What is the meaning of whiteness at your own university? What does it look like? How does it hide itself? How does its very innocence become a site of virulence? When it comes to the disposability of Black bodies, what we need are no illusions about the history of white supremacy, especially the kind that is uneventful, mundane, and everyday. The kind that shows itself each Sunday morning, where white bodies commune together and bond together, where Black bodies are de facto absent through iterative white practices of exclusion. So here we need to ask of your own university, how many Blacks are on your campus? I don't know, maybe you all can tell me and give me the figure. How does that figure look in relationship to white students? Or what is the ratio between faculty of color, Black faculty, and white faculty? What does this mean? And what does this mean in terms of racial justice or injustice? White bodies at these churches, they commune together, they bond. As Sarah Ahmed would say, where bodies trail behind their actions, where whiteness goes unmarked, where it's innocent, where white people, in virtue of being white, move through normative spaces with no need to ask themselves, am I wanted here? Do I belong here? Within the context of how I think about the complexity of whiteness and white people engaging in processes of attempting to undo whiteness, the concept of arrival has very little, if any, purchase. When white people stress arrival vis-a-vis their anti-racism, this can function to keep them what I call sutured or covered over, from lingering with the profound and intricate layers of white supremacy. Kenosis, K-E-N-O-S-I-S, which means emptying, in relationship to white racism involves diligence and a constant process of return. There's no single and total kenotic moment of emptying of white racist sedimentations, assumptions, images, and affects. This is why I continue to stress the importance of nurturing a disposition to be unsutured, a disposition to crack, re-crack, and crack again the calcified operations of the white gaze of white being, where white being dilates, opens, and takes the form of who art thou? White people, as James Baldwin would say, must stand and confront history, do battle with forms of historical creation that have gotten us to this place. A place where whiteness and white people refuse to fail, to be undone, fail to lose themselves to an address that comes from outside of themselves, from outside of their white gazes, from Black people and people of color. Baldwin says, and we're just 2 paragraphs done before we're done. Baldwin says, quote, love takes off masks that we fear we cannot live within, cannot live without, and know we cannot live within. Bell Hooks says that love involves telling the truth to ourselves and to others. Black theologian James Cone says, quote, love is a refusal to accept whiteness. To love is to make a decision against white racism, end quote. So where are those whites who are refusing to accept whiteness in the name of love? Where are those whites who don't see themselves storming the Capitol, or who don't see themselves as whites who came to Charlottesville, Virginia, to unite the right? If you are not, or rather, if you don't see yourself as that version of whiteness, I would ask you to show me your wounds from being unsutured. So as you can see, I'm challenging the distinction between the whites who stormed the Capitol and whites who is quote unquote innocent. Dr. Martin Luther King says that racism, quote, is like a boil that can never be cured as long as it is covered up, but must be opened with all of its pus flowing ugliness, end quote. If Black lives really matter to white people, I desire to see white people explode, to see their white rage turned against their white power and their complicity with white supremacy. I would like to see their white rage overflow in the streets of this nation, shouting, my whiteness is a lie, that my white innocence is the crime. I desire to see white people in massive droves lay down the armory of white privilege, white innocence, and tear apart, be in crisis. Crisis, as I'm using the term, is a species of metanoia, which is a kind of perceptual and psychic breakdown. It isn't about immediate repair, but involves tarrying within the space of breakdown. I want to see an America where white lives cease to matter because they are white. But let's end on the indispensable question, though one asked with love, the kind of love that Baldwin says is about removing masks. So I pose the question again. What if to be white in America is to be a racist? And if your university is predominantly white, what does that mean about your university? What does that mean about where I teach at Emory University, which is a predominantly white institution, PWI? Again, what if to be white in America is to be a racist? If this is the case, then what are we to do? What are white people to do? And what's at stake for Black people and people of color? Thank you.
Dr. Yancy, thank you.
Can I ask a favor? Can I take just a 1-minute break?
Absolutely.
Thank you. I'll come
And then
right
we
back.
have some questions for you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for your questions. Please feel free to add additional questions to the list and we will get to as many of them as we can when Dr. Yancy returns in a moment.
Okay, I am ready.
Fantastic, Dr. Yancy, thank you. I'm going to go in the order that the questions were posted, and I'm going to read them in the exact language which they were written. The first question, what type of Black response did you get for your letter to white America?
Oh, good question. Empathetic. And I might guess, though, that there may have been maybe one or two Black folk who were conservative, who may have said something like, as whites often hold, that the only reason that racism exists in this country, Dr. Yancy, is because of people like you. The fact that racism exists because you keep talking about it, right? But that would have been rare. But it's not impossible that I didn't get a message, a particular message from a Black person. But for the most part, there were letters of, in other words, it was a letter of love. It was a letter of the kind of love that Baldwin talks about, where he says that love removes the mask that we're afraid to live beyond, that we're afraid to remove, right? But I wanted to peel back that mask, rip that mask off so that white people could see themselves as I see them and as people of color see them. So I may have received such a response, but the majority of the responses came from white people. Both, I'm assuming, what we would call white supremacists and also white innocent people. I remember one white woman wrote to me and she said, Dr. Yancy, Martin Luther King would be rolling in his grave right now because you are talking about whiteness, that you are calling people by the saying white. But I want to know, what Dr. King did they read? Because they certainly didn't read the Martin Luther King that I've read. Martin Luther King actually said, believe it or not, he said, sadly to say, but the vast majority of white people are racist either consciously or unconsciously. But this, when whites pose that kind of question, it's a way of obfuscating the importance of pointing out racism in our culture. I mean, Martin Luther King wasn't saying, well, even though he said that we should judge each other on the basis of the content of our character, not on the color of our skin, but he's talking about a moment where that society collectively and systemically attempts to overcome white supremacy, right? He's not saying within the very belly of white supremacy, we ought not to call out whiteness, because that's so important. Hence, that's why he marched. That's why he engaged in nonviolent protests, civil disobedience, right? So the beauty is that for the most part, the majority of messages came from white people, well-intending white people, well-intentioned white people, quote unquote, good white people. Again, those people were Black, really said that we identify with what you said and we thank you for having the courage to call out whiteness the way you did. Thanks for that question.
Thank you. The next question, Dr. Yancy, thank you for speaking to us today. What is white America? And are there places within the United States where you feel white America is not the prevailing order?
My answer to that would have to be no, meaning I don't think there are any places in white America where it isn't the prevailing order. Because my argument goes like this. To be white is to have white privilege. If you all want to read someone who writes about this, read Peggy McIntosh. It's a very straightforward article, very straightforward argument. I like it. I read Peggy McIntosh, I think, more radically than Peggy McIntosh reads herself. But she talks about how when you're white, you can do things like go shopping without being followed in a store in virtue of your whiteness. Or you can be stopped by police without having to worry or say, here we go again. You have the privilege to worry that your being stopped had to do with a taillight being out or the fact that you failed to signal. When Black people are stopped, we often will say, here we go again, because we're being stopped in virtue of our Blackness. Tim Wise, by the way, if you guys know Tim Wise, he writes about white privilege, significant philosophical, significant social gadfly. He said he was stopped. He said he was driving in his car once, and he's white. Windows were tinted, and he was blasting music. He says the police pulled him over, walked up to his window, and said, roll your window down. When Tim Wise rolled his window down, the words that came out of the police officer, the word was O. O. What did O mean? O meant I expected you to be black and you were white. And then went on to tell Tim Wise how he could beat a ticket were he given a ticket. And if you know the case here in Georgia, not too long ago, a white woman was frantic because a white police officer pulled her over. She was so frantic, she said, I've never been pulled over, I'm just afraid. Look this up. The white police officer says, don't you know we shoot black people? Don't you know we shoot black people? I mean, to reassure this white woman that she was safe, is that the only thing he could say? But that's the way whiteness works. Whiteness, according to my argument, is structurally binary. It needs bodies that are different from itself. Ruth Frankenberg, who's a critical whiteness theorist, she's passed away. She said that when whites are often asked, what does it mean for them to be white? The answer is, I'm not that. And you kind of go, well, what do you mean? What is whiteness? It's not that. But notice what it's doing. It's pointing to the black. It's pointing to the brown. It's pointing to the red. It's saying, I am not that. That's what whiteness is. But that doesn't constitute anything. That's just a negation, right? So my argument is that to the extent that white privilege continues to exist, the fact that whiteness constitutes the transcendental norm, what I say in America, and by the transcendental norm, I mean that whiteness goes unmarked, it goes unnamed. Everybody has heard of BET. Everybody knows what BET is. It's Black Entertainment Television. But have you ever heard of WET? W-E-T, White Entertainment Television? No, WET is the norm, right? And to the extent that whites continue, even poor whites, Du Bois recognized this a long time ago. You can have two groups of people. You can have poor whites and poor black whites picking cotton at the same time, but they remain segregated because whiteness is a particular form of property and a particular privilege that black people don't get to have. So even if you're poor and white, you still have something called white privilege. You still get to walk in places and be accepted because all you have to do is dress yourself up. But I can't hide skin color. I can't hide this epidermis, right? Because it's deemed a problem way before I even arrive. So is there white innocence in America? No. Are there white people who fight against racism? Yes. But do they escape? No. Because at the end of the day, as I argue in the letter, see, in my letter, I try to create a bridge between myself and white people. I argued that I'm a sexist. This is my way of trying to create a bridge, a kind of community. And I know that I'm not a sexist in the form of Bill Cosby. I know that I'm not a sexist in the form of Harvey Weinstein or Epstein. I know that. But I have internalized sexist assumptions. My gaze has been influenced by patriarchy and misogyny and the ways in which I too am guilty of and complicit with structural forms of patriarchy, even as a black man. Right? So when I talk about whites, the good whites, what I want to see is, I'll answer it this way and then I'll go on to the next question. You'll notice that if you watch CNN, Anderson Cooper, who is white, will often have pundits on, and they will all agree. Let's say when they were talking about Charlottesville, he had black pundits, white pundits, they would all agree that there's a problem in Charlottesville. I agree too. But notice what happens there. At no point does Anderson Cooper, as a white man, say to his guests, but wait a minute, I too am white. I too am part of a system that oppresses people of color. I too have privilege in ways that my black pundits don't have. And I don't hear white people who are good whites saying that. Rather, they want to distinguish themselves from the KKK, the neo-Nazis, the Proud Boys, right? But in making that distinction, I'm arguing that they're failing to look at their own white supremacy and their own perpetuation of white supremacy. Thank you for that question.
The next question. What can you say more about the coffin freighter comment in relation to the history of the Middle Passage and everything since?
What was the coffin freighter? What was that?
I think that was in one of the comments that you read that you received. Someone said you had two choices.
Yes, good, excellent. Well, here's an unmitigated, here's a blatant, unabashed claim that there are two ways I can go back to Africa: on a passenger ship or in a coffin, in essence. In other words, Yancy, if you don't leave the US soon, you're going to be dead. You have to realize something, that as a philosopher, I didn't become a philosopher wanting to receive this kind of white racist vitriol, right? To have my very life threatened, right? I have children, for crying out loud, right? I mean, they have a dad who they love, right? I'm married, my wife loves me. So I didn't become a philosopher to do this, but now I've come to think about philosophy as a site of suffering. Philosophy, like Aristotle said, it was like, philosophy is like wonder. Well, it's still that, but for me, philosophy is suffering. Because when I have to engage in critical speech, which I must do for the sake of my own Black children, my Black sons, and also for white people, particularly white children, right? Which is a strange place to be, by the way, when you're writing on behalf of white people to empower them, even as you're being called a nigger. So here's a case where Black people and people of color have to do the additional work to be almost savior figures and yet still be denigrated and bastardized and relegated to the insignificant. That's a strange place to be. So the reference to the freighter then is a way of saying, we will put, oh, that's a beautiful question. It's like saying, we will take you in reverse. We will send you back across the Atlantic, right? Because remember, in the holds of those ships was the confluence of blood, pus, feces, urine, rats, disease over periods of months. In the holds of those ships, they would put Black people, they would put people in holds that were fit for 2,000, rather for 100, and they would put 500 in a single hold. So you can imagine what that was like, right? And that's why some Black folk just jumped overboard with their kids in their hands, committed suicide rather than to live that kind of misery, that kind of existential angst. So this is putting me in reverse. And my argument is that Black people are still, for those who are familiar with the theories of Afro-pessimism, there's a part of my philosophical stance that is Afro-pessimist, that in other words, Black people always occupy a position that no other person can take. In other words, the place of degradation is already taken, without, by the way, removing our knowledge and recognition of indigenous people here before we were. We must never forget that. But we are, as Black people, in a position where no other can stand. We are the wretched. We are the quintessence of wretchedness, vis-a-vis whiteness, right? So there's a way in which we're still in the bottom of the ship. As some Black poet has said, there is no sort of over the other side of the Red Sea, right? There is no other side where we're free. Pharaoh is on both sides of the sea. So think about Pharaoh as whiteness writ large, right? So the question really becomes, that what are Black people to do? And the remarkable thing, as Baldwin says, the remarkable thing is that Black people have done the impossible in the face of the impossible. Because how are we supposed to exist? And I want you all to take it, for those who are listening, this is not a critique of your university as such. It's a critique of all predominantly white institutions. And you have to think about what a talk like this means. And you have to think about whether or not this kind of talk will be taken as a talk to sort of come in, say a few words, and then leave, because that's what will happen, right? I mean, technically speaking, I will leave, right? But the question becomes, what will stay after this talk? What will happen? I'm doubtful that much happens at all. My impression is that institutions that are predominantly white, they want to hear, they want to almost be spanked, so to speak. But in terms of transformation, there's a little bit of transformation that's being done. Now, I looked up some stats, and I think that the majority of the faculty there are white. I read something like 70% white. I could be wrong. And 1.3% Black faculty? My question is, what is this community that you're working with? Again, I'm not condemning. I've been brought here as a guest, and I'm honored to be here. But I would critique your university as I would critique my own at Emory University, right? What's going on at these predominantly white institutions? How can Black people possibly feel safe if you're not representing their voices? What is it that white philosophers, white sociologists, psychologists, you name it, what do they have to teach unless those white professors, unless they're dealing and struggling with their whiteness on a daily basis? What does it mean? And it seems to me it doesn't mean anything if we don't call into question whiteness as it exists in its innocent forms, in its everyday forms, either at your university or at mine.
Thank you. The next question. Thank you, Professor Yancy, for a very engaging and moving talk. I noticed that, quote, whiteness, unquote, seemed to have a different meaning in different contexts. Can you clarify how you define the term, quote, whiteness and its multiple senses?
Yeah. When I said good. So when I said multiple senses, I probably meant literally sort of multiple senses, the way in which whiteness exists in the gaze, the white gaze, the way in which it exists in the nose, the way in which it's what you smell, it's what you hear, it's what you see. I think that's what I may have meant by the sense. That's sometimes what I mean by it. And the reason that I talk about this is because I want to show the ways in which whiteness is not simply an ideology. It's not simply a set of beliefs, but it's a mode of being. It's a mode of being. I'll give you an example. Lillian Smith, you guys should read this book called Killers of the Dream. Lillian Smith early on was writing as a white woman, and she had a case where they decided to go against Jim Crow and Jane Crow racism. So she brought a white friend with her to eat with Black people. As they sat down to eat, because they were going against Jim Crow laws, her white friend, began to vomit. She couldn't hold her food, right? So here's a case where whiteness, despite her good intentions, this white woman, her body rebelled against her. There's a way in which her body was saying, I'm not having it. I will not sit next to Black people and eat my food. And there's so many examples of the ways in which whiteness is opaque, the ways in which white people can't even recognize their own whiteness. There are examples of white people who are hooked up to MRI machines, and they're shown photos of Black faces and white faces. And they're hooked up to MRI machines that look at their amygdala, the amygdala. And what happens is they're shown images at a millisecond, which is 1,000th of a second. So they can't possibly cognitively know that they saw a Black face or white face. But once they have seen a Black face, there's a lot of activity in the amygdala. When they've seen a white face, not a lot of activity. So what's going on at the level of the unconscious as a site, as a force that's operating such that white people don't even quite understand the limits of their own racism, right? I think that there are ways in which, whiteness is variated in terms of gender, class, sexual orientation. That's the way in which I'd want to contextualize whiteness. I think we should do that. But for me, given that I theorize whiteness in the way I do as the transcendental norm, as a site of privilege, which means a site of immunity, because if you look up privilege, it comes from privus lex, which means private law. There's a way in which whiteness constitutes a private law. My claim is that even the most sophisticated anti-white racists are themselves racists. So at the end of the day, the best that I can become is an anti-sexist sexist. So for me, the best that white people can become are anti-racist racists, because they continue to exist within a racist context, and they continue to be inundated and to have already been claimed by whiteness in the deep recesses of their consciousness. Thanks for that question.
Dr. Yancy, you answered a number of questions with that answer. Are you doing all right to take a few more?
Oh yeah, please let's go. I'm looking at some of the names here. I'm assuming there are people who are here, and I'm seeing some pretty outstanding people, some of whom I know. And I'm not going to call their names out, but I'm glad they're here nonetheless.
Oh,
Thank you.
Fantastic. Yeah. So this question, I fear that to be a sexist as a consequence of being a man, or to be a racist as a consequence of being white, trivializes sexism or racism involving intent. Do you think there's a difference between racism based on consequence and racism based on intent? If
Excellent.
so, do you think there ought to be new terminology or language to help navigate the issues?
Excellent question. I don't make that distinction. Let me back up and say, yes, that is a good distinction and a very important distinction. But it's a distinction that would have us distinguish between, I think, what happened in Charlottesville, what happened at the Capitol, and what happens when, for an example, a white professor will teach philosophy without going outside of the canon of philosophy. So I see that there's a continuity between the two, right? Or the white woman who tugs on her purse. Now, clearly, I'm hoping that there's no white person within the sound of my voice who's part of the Klan, right? Or who's neo-Nazi, or the Proud Boys for that matter. I know that distinction, that's important, but for me, making these distinctions, I'm not saying that man qua man, I'm not saying because I have a penis, I'm therefore a sexist, no. And I'm not saying that because you have less melanin means that you're a racist. Now that would be a form of essentialism that I think would just fall flat on its face. It's what the penis, it's what maleness has come to mean through history, that's the problem. And it's what whiteness has come to mean and to signify within the context of white supremacy. That's the problem, right? So our problem is not with biology. It's not a problem with the epidermis in terms of melanin. It's a problem of structures and norms that created the problem. But let me say something. Check out the work of Iris Marion Young. This is to the person who asked the question, and anyone else. Look at her work, and she makes a distinction between the liability model of responsibility and the connection model of responsibility. The liability model is more of the intentional model. And this is precisely what Peggy McIntosh says. When she thought about racism, when she was taught, she was made to think about it as intentional acts deliberately done by mean white people against other people. Notice that definition. But then in the same passage, pretty much, she says, but I never was taught to think about white racism in terms of systems that give me power and privilege, regardless of my intentions, regardless of my intentions. And this is what Iris Marion Young says. She wants to hold tight the liability model, but at the same time rethink responsibility within a context where there are forms of hegemony and power that are systemic, which means you're complicit with it regardless of your intentions. So she says something like this: we often think about what is bad as that which deviates from a criterion that specifies what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, and what is not normal. In other words, badness is usually defined as that which deviates from what is acceptable and normal. Interesting distinction, but notice what she's saying. She wants to say that we failed then to understand what is acceptable and what is normal to be the problem. You see? So my distinction using Iris Marion Young and using Peggy McIntosh, both of whom are white, I'm saying that the problem is not about genetics, the problem is not about biology, the problem is not about skin color as such, the problem is not about physiology. The problem is that we live in a context. And again, my argument actually brings far more significance and far more weight to bear on whiteness than the question that the person posed suggests. Because in pointing out to trouble the distinction between the Klan and good white people, think of all the good white people you know. I want to trouble that distinction. And I want to ask those good white people, what are you doing to disrupt your whiteness? If you get to walk in a store with me while I get to walk in a store, and the white security guard pulls me over and stops me and checks me, you didn't get checked. You might say, well, I'm not the white security guard. But guess what? You are white. And to the extent that you got to walk into that store without being stopped, it means that you get to walk with innocence and immunity. It means that you benefit from your whiteness. But to the extent that you benefit from that whiteness, you are touching me. It is a haptic relationship whereby your whiteness is purchased precisely because I'm stopped. Do you get, unfortunately, I can't see you all's faces, but do you get the point, right? The point is that you get to walk innocently, but in doing that, you are touching me because I'm being stopped. You see? So in a way, it is as if you've signed an invisible contract with the white security guard that says, I'm okay. I get to walk through and I'm innocent. I'm not going to steal anything. As the statistics have it, more white people shoplift than black folk, right? So think about that, right? So I want to say no. My distinction actually brings more pressure to bear, or more truth to bear, perhaps even more love to bear on making white people conscious of their complicity. And once they understand that complicity, I want them to live with that and understand it and feel the weight of it and to be transformed by that weightness. To ask yourself the question, what is my responsibility for the death of George Floyd? What is my responsibility for the death of Breonna Taylor? What is my responsibility for the death and impoverishment of people of color and Black people in this society? That's the question we have to ask. And then we have to go to bed with that. We have to ask, how does the blood of people run? How is it on my hands? Because I'm doing the same thing. I'm asking myself at night, what did I fail to do today? What didn't I do to help to free this world of oppression and misery and sexism, patriarchy, militarism, capitalism, inordinate greed? I'm posing that question to myself. And to pose that question to yourself seriously is to feel pain, because you no longer feel innocent. And I don't want you to wallow in it, mind you. Guilt is easy. We're not talking about guilt here. I'm not trying to guilt white people. It's easy for white people to say, yeah, I'm responsible for that. I did that, sure. And that's it, right? But what we want is a transformation of the very consciousness of a people. We want them to look at themselves in what Baldwin says is a disagreeable mirror. And the disagreeable mirror is the ways in which Black people and people of color see you if you're white. I argue that white people have to develop a form of double consciousness, call it white double consciousness, where they see themselves in the eyes of Black people and people of color. And to tarry with that and be patient with that, sit with that and feel the weight of it. I'm still ready if there's another question.
Oh, that's fantastic. There's more questions. Thank you. And thank you for your generosity. It's a little later in Georgia.
Yeah, it is. Okay.
Is there such a thing as Black philosophy, or is that an oxymoron? And this is similar to other questions, Dr. Yancy, about this is philosophy.
Oh, good.
What would it mean to claim the coexistence, the uncomfortable reckoning of institutional denial that racism can even be a subject of philosophy, versus betraying the discipline altogether for spaces where our philosophy is perhaps more resilient and more often affirmed, the poetry of Maya, the prose of Baldwin, or Morrison?
Oh, you may have to read that third one over, but let me try answering the first two first, right?
Okay, you bet.
So yes, I mean, from the perspective of white people, look, I think there are many white people, when you walk into a room and you're the philosopher, many white students will go, oh, like, whoa. I mean, I've heard stories of Black women who are philosophers who will sit in the classroom before the students arrive. And it's sort of like, they just think she's a student. And then when she stands up, they may take her to be maybe a TA, but not the philosopher, right? So when I say that Black philosophy, no, but Black philosophy is not an oxymoron, because when we talk about Black philosophy, we don't mean that somehow philosophy has a color. We don't mean that. What we mean is that if you're interested, for the person who asked this question, read Charles Mills's article, Non-Cartesian Sums, S-U-M-S, Non-Cartesian Sums. And in that article, he argues for African-American philosophy or Black philosophy by basically saying, think about Descartes' project, where if you're Black and you're listening, imagine if imagine if George Floyd was in a class of mine on a Thursday, and let's say he survived the whole horrible knee to the throat on Wednesday. Let's assume that he survived that. And he came to my classroom on Thursday and I was teaching Descartes. Descartes, for those who know, in the Meditations, he argues that we can put into doubt our own existence. We don't know whether other minds exist. We don't know if the material world exists. In fact, we're not even sure if we exist, according to Descartes. Well, Mills argues in this piece that Black philosophy or African-American philosophy has to argue, right? Because there's a way in which white philosophy, and by whiteness, he not only means monochromatic whiteness, the fact that the field, look, philosophy is one of the most whitest of the humanities, right? Black people make about 1.1% of the professional philosophers. There might be 50 Black women in this country who have PhDs in philosophy, right? But Mills also talks about the conceptual or intellectual, the conceptual or theoretical whiteness of the discipline. And what he says is contrast Descartes' project with Ellison. Everybody, maybe you guys read Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. Well, in the Invisible Man, white people don't see him and he has to bump into them to make them see him. So he's already rendered visible, or in some cases, Black bodies are rendered hypervisible. So when Descartes says, let's all think about the ways in which we may not exist, Mill says that that is an assumption that is conceptually white, in as much as it speaks of a certain kind of privilege, that one is even able to suspend the certainty of one's own existence, or whether one has a body. And imagine George Floyd coming to my classroom on Thursday, having survived Chauvin's knee on his neck, saying to me, Dr. Yancy, are you kidding me? Are you serious? Do you really want me to think about the fact that I don't exist when there's a world out there that is anti-Black, right? So the idea then is to bring the Black experience in conversation to the Anglo-American European philosophical tradition. That's the idea, right? So it's not Black in the sense that it's colored. It's Black in terms of historical sensibilities, historical intuitions, historical modes of being, right? That's the way that works. Just think about feminist philosophy. Feminist philosophy challenges the phallocentric, androcentric assumptions embedded within philosophy. So that now we have, or I shouldn't say now we have a whole tradition of feminist philosophy that looks at ontology, epistemology, the philosophy of science very differently now, which I think is so important in terms of the plurality of voices that are in philosophy, and also the interdisciplinary and de-disciplinary moves that philosophers have to make. So that's one question. This is philosophy. Yes, it is. It's philosophy that you haven't been familiar with though, right? Because keep in mind, for me, when I studied, look, you guys have to remember, I went to the University of Pittsburgh, which is a highly analytic philosophy department. At that point, I was interested in things like whether apples, when they're in your refrigerator, are still red when you don't see them. Right? You guys have heard the story, if a tree falls in the forest, does it make a sound? Those for me were like key philosophical issues, right? They still excite me, but not as much, not as much. By the time I went to Yale, I was interested in hermeneutics, which is the whole, Gadamer's work, interpretation. I was interested in philosophy of science, and whether philosophy of science, I was interested in the work of Thomas S. Kuhn, all of these figures, whether or not science makes claims that are outside of its paradigms. But then only later did I move into this whole subject of critical whiteness studies and critical critical race theory. And I'll tell you why. Because philosophy for me is suffering. Look, if you're taking philosophy courses and you come out of those philosophy courses unmoved, somebody's doing something wrong. So I'm speaking to those philosophy majors and to those philosophers right now. If when you teach philosophy, if your students are looking at those ideas as if they're abstract problems with no concrete relevance in the world, then you have failed them. I'm just going to put it just like that. When my students leave my class, if they're laughing and smiling, I have failed them, right? Which is not to say that they don't sometimes laugh and smile, right? But the idea is to carry the weight of that. The idea is that philosophy ought to speak to what we also ought to do, not just in terms of what we ought to think. Philosophy should have us hold, philosophy ought to make us outraged, to give us a sense of passion, which means to suffer, right? That's what philosophy should do. It should move us. We should be gadflies in the tradition of Plato and Socrates, or at least Socrates, right? We should make people uneasy. We should question the status quo. We should challenge hegemonic structures. This is what philosophy should do. And this, when you take my courses, this is what philosophy looks like. Even as earlier today, I taught the first meditation of Descartes, right? But the idea is that I teach more than that, right? And I problematize it. So yes, it is philosophy, but it's different from what you've seen. Now that third question, if you can reiterate that one, I just didn't hear it.
Absolutely. The third part of the question, let's see. Where our philosophy is perhaps more resilient and more often affirmed, the poetry of Maya, the prose of Baldwin or Morrison, is this where Black philosophy reconstitutes itself as most salient, alive, palpable?
Interesting question. Okay. If you read Cornel West, and I'm teaching a seminar on Cornel West, you all may have seen my interview with Cornel West in Truth Out, because he just left Harvard, as you all know. He's going back to Union Theological Seminary. There's an interview in there that we had just before he left. Cornel West does argue that He argues with Plato because Plato is not very kind to the poets, right? Poetry for him does not contain truth. But I would say yes. I think it's important that we think about a Baldwin, think about a Martin Luther King, a Maya Angelou, think about a Toni Morrison, think about Audre Lorde, think about Ella Baker, think about all of these figures that we just don't generally put within the canon of philosophy. They're just excluded. I think Black philosophy, what it wants to do, it wants to say, look, we have marginalized and placed under erasure significant philosophical voices that come with deep philosophical epistemic perspectives that we have simply erased, right? So yes, we need to ask the question, as Cornel West raises the question. I mean, Cornel says, look, he wants to bring in the Russian writer Anton Chekhov. He wants to look at Shakespeare. He wants to bring in Emerson and all these figures to begin to think about the way in which philosophy is grander than the way in which professional philosophers have traditionally narrowed the field, right? So my answer to your question is yes. I think that for us in Black philosophy, I think that when we talk about Africana philosophy or African-American philosophy, I think the idea is to expand the voice to include all of those voices. And hence, we need to include the blues as a musical motif. We have to include jazz. We have to include rap and hip hop also as these voices that have been marginalized, where the philosophical is rendered null and void in their voices. But how more philosophical can you be than the blues, right? And a blues people where you feel the pain and sting of anti-Black racism, or where you feel the sorrow from a loved one who leaves you. But in the morning, you say that in the morning, I will get up and walk away. I will find the strength. I mean, how more philosophical can you be, right? In talking about agency and yet not allowing despair to have the last word. So I absolutely agree with that point. Thank you for that.
Thank you. I think I speak for the 100+ people who are still hanging on your every word that we could probably go for a while. And so I think we have to make a decision to stop. And I just really want to thank you so much for your attention, your incredible attention to all of those questions, for being here tonight, and for everything that you shared. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it. It was wonderful. And I think that what I would leave you with is, before you go to bed tonight, all of you, wherever you happen to be, whether you're white or not, to just think about the ways in which, right before you close your eyes and go off to sleep, think about the ways in which you are not an atom, that neoliberalism is problematic and false, but that all of us are connected to each other. And the question, and COVID-19 has taught us that. So what do we do? How do you make the world a better place? How do you make the world a less racist, homophobic, xenophobic, a world, right? How do we carry the weight of those who suffer, the least of these? And we have to include the earth as well. What is our relationship to the earth? It's often seen as a thing, but it too is a vow. It speaks to us, it resists. So the question is for us, I think, that some of us are guilty, as Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel put it. Some of us are guilty, but all of us are responsible. So I want all of us to take the weight and feel the weight of that responsibility and make a difference. Thank you.